She stood frozen as red wine dripped down her white gown. 200 guests watched. Her husband rushed forward, but not to help her. He rushed to comfort his mistress. What nobody knew, the mansion they were standing in did not belong to him. It belonged to her, and she had no idea. The father-in-law had hidden this secret for 6 years. Tonight, then he would finally reveal the truth. And the satisfying revenge. You will not believe how it ends. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Hit subscribe and stay until the very last satisfying minute. Trust me, this one is worth it. The wine was not an accident. The humiliation was not spontaneous. And the mansion everyone thought belonged to my husband. That was the biggest lie of all. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the night I stopped being invisible. The Ashford Annual Charity Gala drew 200 of Connecticut's most influential people to the estate that December evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from the 20-foot ceilings, casting prismatic light across marble floors that had been polished until they gleamed like mirrors. A 12-piece orchestra played classical arrangements in the corner, their music weaving through conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes and children attending Ivy League universities. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The women wore designer gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The men wore tailored tuxedos and watches that could have purchased small houses. This was Greenwich society at its finest. Old money and new money mingling together, pretending they were all the same. I stood near the grand staircase wearing an ivory silk gown that had belonged to my mother. She had worn it to her own engagement party 35 years ago, before cancer took her when I was 22. Her pearl necklace rested against my collarbone, cool and familiar against my skin. These were the only things I had left of her now, the only things my husband had not managed to take from me. My name is Caroline Whitfield Ashford. I am 32 years old. 6 years ago, I married into one of Connecticut's wealthiest families. I gave up my architecture firm, a small but growing practice that I had built from nothing after graduate school. I moved away from my friends in Boston. I stopped returning calls from colleagues who wondered where I had disappeared to. I became Mrs. Preston Ashford III, and somewhere along the way, I became invisible. I watched my husband from across the ballroom now. Preston stood near the bar with his hand resting on the small of another woman's back. The gesture was casual, intimate, possessive, the kind of touch a man reserves for someone he considers his Vanessa Blake, his mistress. She wore a red dress that hugged every curve of her body. Her blonde hair cascaded over bare shoulders in perfect waves. Her heels were at least 4 inches high, and they clicked against the marble with an arrogant precision that announced her presence to everyone in the room. She laughed at something Preston whispered in her ear, throwing her head back as if she owned this mansion, as if she owned my life. I had known about their affair for 2 years. I had found the first text message by accident, picking up Preston's phone when mine was charging and his buzzed with a notification. The words had burned themselves into my memory. Last night was incredible. When can I see you again? I had confronted him that evening. He had laughed. He had called me paranoid. He had told me I was imagining things, that Vanessa was just a colleague from work, that I was embarrassing myself with unfounded accusations. And when I had pressed harder, showing him the message, his expression had shifted from dismissive to dangerous. You will never mention this again, he had said quietly. Do you understand me? If you cause problems, I will make sure you leave this marriage with nothing. Not a penny, not a friend, not a shred of reputation. I had believed him. I had swallowed the truth because I thought silence would protect me. I thought if I behaved properly, if I smiled at the right moments and disappeared at the right times, the storm would pass. I thought I could wait him out. I thought eventually he would grow tired of her, and things would return to whatever normal had once been. But storms do not pass when you let them. They grow. A gentle hand touched my elbow, startling me from my thoughts. Theodore Ashford Sr. smiled down at me. My father-in-law was 70 years old, tall and dignified even now, with silver hair swept back from a face that had graced the covers of business magazines for decades. He had built Ashford Properties from a single commercial building into a real estate empire spanning 3 states. He was the kind of man whose word could make or break careers, whose approval was sought by politicians and CEOs alike. But his eyes, when they looked at his son across the room, carried a permanent disappointment that no amount of wealth could disguise. "Caroline," he said warmly, "you look beautiful tonight. That dress suits you." "Thank you, Theodore." It was my mother's. He nodded, understanding the weight of that statement. He had met my mother once, briefly, at our wedding. He had told me afterward that he could see where I got my grace from. Now he squeezed my hand and leaned close. His voice dropped to a murmur that only I could hear. "You have always been too good for this family. Caroline Offenwell, remember that? Whatever happens, remember that you deserve better than what my son has given you." I dismissed the words as his usual kindness. Theodore often said things like that when he had been drinking champagne at these events. He was a sentimental man beneath the boardroom exterior, prone to moments of unexpected tenderness that seemed at odds with his ruthless reputation. What I did not notice was his other hand, how it slipped into my evening clutch while he embraced me, how he left something behind, something small and metallic that settled at the bottom of the bag beneath my lipstick and compact mirror. I should have paid attention. I should have asked what he meant. I should have wondered why his eyes looked so sad when he pulled away. But at that moment, I was watching Vanessa cross the room toward me. She moved like a flame through darkness, drawing every eye as she passed. Her smile was sharp, predatory, filled with a satisfaction that made my stomach clench with dread. Her path was deliberate. She was not simply walking through the party. She was walking toward me. And suddenly I understood that whatever happened next had been planned long before I arrived. The night was about to change everything. Vanessa intercepted me near the champagne tower, her perfume arriving before she did. It was expensive, overwhelming, the kind of scent that demanded attention and refused to be ignored. Her smile was all teeth, bright and white and somehow threatening. "Carolyn?" She said my name like it tasted sour, dragging out each syllable with exaggerated sweetness. "I did not expect to see you out here mingling with the guests. I assumed you would be hiding in a corner somewhere, watching from a safe distance like you always do." Several guests nearby turned to listen. Vanessa had pitched her voice to Carrie, ensuring an audience for whatever performance she had planned. I kept my voice steady, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "Good evening, Vanessa. I hope you are enjoying the party." She looked me up and down slowly, deliberately, her gaze traveling from my face to my dress to my shoes and back again. The examination was designed to make me feel small, to remind me that she considered herself superior in every measurable way. "That dress is so vintage," she said finally. The word dripped with condescension. Did it belong to someone else first, a grandmother? Perhaps it has that antique quality about it. Her friends nearby giggled, a chorus of manufactured amusement. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but kept my expression neutral. I had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged predators. "It was my mother's," I replied quietly. "She wore it to her engagement party." Something flickered across Vanessa's face. Surprise, perhaps, at the personal nature of my answer, but she recovered quickly, her smile stretching even wider. "Oh, how sentimental." She paused, letting the moment hang in the air like a held breath. "It is a shame ivory washes you out so badly. You look practically invisible in it. Then again, I suppose that is appropriate. Being invisible seems to be your specialty." The crowd around us had grown. Conversations at nearby tables had softened. Heads had turned. I could feel dozens of eyes pressing against my skin like physical weight, watching this interaction with the hungry curiosity of people who sensed blood in the water. I should have walked away. I should have excused myself to find Dorothy, the housekeeper who had worked for the Ashford family for 20 years and always looked out for me. I should have retreated to the powder room to collect myself, or found Theodore again, or done anything except stand there like a deer frozen in headlights. But something held me in place. Pride, perhaps, stubbornness, or maybe just the desperate hope that if I held my ground, Vanessa would grow bored and move on to easier prey. I was wrong. She reached for a glass of deep red wine from a passing waiter's silver tray. Merlot, from the color of it, dark as blood against the crystal. She swirled it gently, studying the way the liquid caught the chandelier light, and her smile never wavered. "You know," she said casually, "this color might actually help your outfit. It needs something bold, something to make people notice you for once." I saw her wrist begin to rotate. I understood what was about to happen with a clarity that arrived a fraction of a second too late. The entire glass of wine cascaded down the front of my mother's ivory gown. The liquid hit me like ice water, shocking in its coldness despite the room temperature. It splashed across my chest, soaking instantly through the delicate silk, spreading like a wound across the fabric. The wine dripped from my mother's pearls. It stained the bodice in an irregular crimson pattern that would never wash out. It ran down my skirt and pooled at my feet on the polished marble floor. The ballroom fell absolutely silent. 200 guests stared. Camera phones rose from every direction, their screens glowing like rectangular eyes in the dim light. The orchestra stopped mid-note, violins frozen in place. Someone gasped audibly. Someone else laughed nervously, the sound echoing off the chandeliers like breaking glass. Vanessa covered her mouth with theatrical horror, her eyes wide with mock distress. "Oh my God," she exclaimed loudly. "I am so sorry. You just appeared out of nowhere. I had no idea you were standing there." The wine completely slipped from my hand. I could not move. I could not breathe. I stood there with wine dripping from my mother's pearls, my mother's dress destroyed, my humiliation complete and public and permanent. The cold liquid soaked through to my skin. The smell of alcohol rose around me like a cloud. I felt exposed, violated, stripped bare in front of everyone I had spent 6 years trying to impress. Preston materialized from the crowd. My husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me in front of God and our families and 300 wedding guests. He rushed toward us with concern written across his handsome face. But he rushed to Vanessa. "Are you okay?" He grabbed her arm, checking her dress for wine splatter. "Did she bump into you? Are you hurt at all?" The world tilted on its axis. I heard the words but could not process their meaning. He was checking if his mistress was okay. He was asking if I had hurt her. He was blaming me for my own humiliation, in front of everyone, as if I had somehow caused this catastrophe myself. Preston turned to me with barely concealed irritation. His voice dropping to a hiss meant only for my ears. "For heaven's sake, Caroline, you always take everything so personally. You always make scenes at the worst possible moments." He straightened, raising his voice so the nearby guests could hear. "Apologize to Vanessa for startling her. Clearly this was an accident caused by your carelessness." The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Poor thing, the dog though. Did you see that? She just stood there. Why doesn't she say something? She looks like a ghost. Is she going to cry? How embarrassing for the family." My cousin by marriage, Bradley Ashford, pushed through the crowd toward us. Bradley was 34 years old, the family's designated black sheep, cut out of the trust 5 years ago under mysterious circumstances. His face was tight with anger as he stepped between me and Preston. "Everyone saw what happened," Bradley said flatly. She poured the wine deliberately. The whole room watched her do it. Preston's expression hardened into something dangerous. "Stay out of this, Bradley. This is none of your business." He turned back to me, his voice cold. "Apologize? Now, before you embarrass this family any further than you already have." I looked at my husband. I looked at his mistress. I looked at the crowd of wealthy strangers who had watched me be publicly humiliated and done absolutely nothing to intervene. Then I looked down at the crimson stains spreading across my mother's dress, and something inside me finally broke. Not into pieces, into clarity. I woke in the guest bedroom to pale morning light filtering through curtains I had not chosen. The room was decorated in tasteful beiges and creams, impersonal as a hotel suite, because that was essentially what it had become. I had been sleeping here for 7 months now. Preston preferred it that way. He said I disturbed his rest with my tossing and turning, my nightmares, my inability to lie still through the night. The truth was simpler. He wanted Vanessa to feel comfortable when she visited. He wanted the master suite to smell like her perfume, not mine. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw 47 notifications waiting. My stomach clenched as I scrolled through them. The video had gone viral overnight. Someone at the gala had posted footage of the incident, the wine splashing across my dress, my frozen, shocked expression, Preston rushing to check on Vanessa while I stood there dripping and humiliated. The whole disaster had been captured from multiple angles and was now circulating across every social media platform imaginable. The view count had passed 50,000 and was climbing by the minute. The comments were brutal. and I could not stop myself from reading them. Why didn't she fight back? She just stood there like a doormat. Her husband is obviously cheating, and she does nothing about it. Pathetic. I would have thrown wine right back at that woman. Some people deserve what they get. She looks like she has no spine at all. I set the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. The crown molding was intricate, hand-carved by craftsmen who had been dead for a century. I had studied it so many times from this position that I knew every curve and flourish by heart. 6 years. I had given this family 6 years of my life. I had abandoned my architecture career just as it was beginning to take off. I had lost touch with every friend I had made in Boston. I had stopped calling my college roommates, stopped attending professional conferences, stopped being anyone except Mrs. Preston Ashford III. I had become a ghost haunting my own existence. The bedroom door opened without a knock. Preston never knocked. He owned everything in this house, including, he seemed to believe, me. He strode in wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair still damp from the shower. He carried a manila folder in his hand. His expression was cold, businesslike, as if he were entering a board meeting rather than speaking to his wife of 6 years. "We need to discuss something," he announced. He tossed the folder onto the bed. It landed beside my hip, heavy with papers I could not yet see. I picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it. Divorce papers. The words swam before my eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage, irreconcilable differences, division of assets. "I am filing for divorce," Preston announced, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Given your behavior last night and your obvious mental instability, I think it is best for everyone involved." My behavior. I stared at him in disbelief. Vanessa poured wine on me in front of 200 people. His expression did not change. "That is exactly the kind of paranoid accusation I am talking about. You have become delusional, Carolyn. You see attacks everywhere. You create drama where none exists." He straightened his cuffs, checking his reflection in the mirror above the dresser. "My attorney has already frozen the joint accounts as a protective measure. The house is in my family's name. Obviously, the cars are all registered to me. Your phone plan will be canceled by end of business today." He turned back to face me, and I saw nothing in his eyes. No guilt, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that we had ever meant anything to each other. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. I suggest you use them wisely. Pack what you can carry. Leave the jewelry, obviously. Those are family heirlooms that belong to the Ashfords." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "And Carolyn, try not to make this uglier than it needs to be. You have already embarrassed yourself enough for one lifetime." The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. I sat in the guest bedroom of a mansion I had called home for 6 years, surrounded by furniture I had not chosen and art I had not purchased. I had no money, no car, no phone, no friends within 500 miles, no family left alive who could help me. Nothing. Except I remembered Theodore slipping something into my clutch the night before. In all the chaos and humiliation, I had never checked what it was. My evening bag lay crumpled in the corner where I had thrown it after stumbling upstairs last night. I crossed the room on unsteady legs and retrieved it. Inside, beneath my lipstick and compact mirror and the tissue I had used to blot my tears, was a small brass key. A paper tag was attached to it with string. The handwriting on the tag was Theodore's elegant script. "Safe Deposit Box 714, First National Bank of Greenwich." I stared at the key for a long moment, turning it over in my palm. It was cool and heavy, unremarkable in every way except for its existence. Why would Theodore give me access to a safe deposit box? I dried my remaining tears. I got dressed in simple clothes that belonged entirely to me, and I went to find Dorothy. The housekeeper was in the kitchen preparing breakfast she knew Preston would not eat. She was 63 years old with silver-streaked hair and weathered hands that had served this family for 2 decades. She looked up when I entered, her face creasing with concern. "Mrs. Caroline, I saw the video this morning. The whole staff has seen it. Are you all right?" I showed her the key. "Do you know what this opens?" Dorothy wiped her hands carefully on her apron. She glanced toward the hallway to make sure we were alone, then crossed to the kitchen door and closed it firmly. When she turned back to me, Her expression had changed. Harder, more determined. "Before we discuss that key," she said quietly, "there is something you need to see. I have been keeping records for years. Everything that happens in this house. For insurance, for protection." She pulled a flash drive from her apron pocket. "I record all the security cameras. I save everything to personal storage. Mr. Preston does not know." She plugged the drive into her personal laptop, which she kept hidden in the pantry. The footage that appeared on screen showed the gala from an angle I had not seen. A security camera positioned high in the corner of the ballroom. It captured everything with clinical clarity. It showed Vanessa watching me from across the room, waiting, studying my position, moving deliberately toward the champagne tower, selecting the glass of wine with care, positioning herself exactly by timing the pour to exact perfection. Every movement calculated, every action deliberate. It was not an accident. It was an assassination of my reputation, planned and executed with surgical precision. Dorothy met my eyes. "Your husband has been bringing that woman here for 2 years. I have dates, times, photographs, records of every visit." She paused. "I have been waiting for the right moment to give you this information. I believe that moment has arrived." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder. Something sharper. "I need an attorney," I said. Dorothy nodded firmly. "I know just the one. Her name is Margaret Holloway. She practices in Greenwich. She destroys cheating husbands for a living, and she has never lost a case." I looked at the flash drive. I looked at the key. I looked at the woman who had been quietly protecting me all along, waiting for the day when I would finally be ready to fight back. For the first time in 6 years, I had evidence. I had allies. I had a plan. Margaret Holloway's office occupied the top floor of a stone building in downtown Greenwich that had once been a bank. The irony was not lost on me. I was here to reclaim what had been stolen from me, in a building designed to protect wealth. Margaret herself was 60 years old with silver hair cut in a severe bob and steel gray eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they encountered. Her reputation preceded her throughout Connecticut's legal community. In 30 years of practicing family law, she had never lost a case. Husbands who faced her across a courtroom learned to settle quickly or face complete destruction. She reviewed my evidence carefully, spreading documents across her mahogany desk. The footage from Dorothy, the financial records Bradley had promised to gather from his contacts in the company accounting department, the text messages I had saved to my personal cloud before Preston canceled my phone. "This is good," Margaret said finally, tapping her pen against a legal pad. "Better than most clients bring me in the initial consultation. The affair documentation alone gives us significant leverage. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, which means you are legally entitled to half of all marital assets." She leaned back in her leather chair. "However, I should warn you that your husband has already begun hiding money. His attorneys filed the divorce petition 3 days ago. He has a head start. 3 days ago, I stared at her. Before the gala. Before any of this happened." Margaret nodded grimly. "He has been planning this for some time. The wine incident was not spontaneous. It was designed to create a public record of your instability." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had thought I was the one who had been caught off guard. I had thought Preston's cruelty at the gala was reactive, impulsive, driven by momentary embarrassment. But he had filed for divorce before the party even began. The humiliation had been orchestrated, a trap I had walked into without ever seeing the walls close around me. "What about this key I showed her, safe deposit box 714? My father-in-law gave it to me the night of the gala. I do not know what is inside." Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. "We need to find out before your husband does. If Theodore gave you access to something, there is a reason. He is not a man who acts without purpose." The next morning, I went to the First National Bank of Greenwich alone. The building was old and dignified, marble columns flanking a brass-framed entrance. A manager escorted me to the vault after I presented my identification and the key. Safe deposit box. 714 was small, perhaps 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. Inside, I found 3 items. A legal document bound in blue backing, a handwritten letter on Theodore's personal stationery, and a certified copy of a property deed. I read the deed first. My hands began to shake before I finished the first paragraph. The document transferred full ownership of Ashford Manor and all its contents from Theodore Ashford Sr. to Caroline Whitfield Ashford. It was dated 6 years ago, the exact date of my wedding. The mansion was mine. It had always been mine. Preston had no idea. The letter explained everything. Dear Caroline, Theodore had written in his elegant script, I saw what my son was becoming long before you married him. I watched him manipulate his way through prep school. I watched him destroy classmates who threatened his position. I watched him treat women as possessions to be acquired and discarded. I knew he would eventually try to destroy you the same way he destroys everything he cannot control. This house is my insurance policy for you. I transferred ownership on your wedding day because I wanted you to have protection from the beginning. I hoped you would never need to use it. I hoped my son would change. But hope is not a strategy, and I have learned to plan for the worst. When you are ready to claim your life back, use this deed. Show it to the right people at the right time. You have always been the strongest person in this family, even when you did not realize it. I am sorry it took tragedy to prove it. With respect and hope for your future. Theodore. I returned to Margaret's office with the documents clutched against my chest like armor. When she saw the deed, her lips curved into a rare smile. Well, she said, this changes absolutely everything. But before we could plan our next move, her secretary knocked urgently on the door. Mrs. Holloway, there is a process server downstairs. He has papers for Mrs. Ashford. The papers were a counterclaim from Preston's attorney. He had anticipated my response. His filing included forged psychiatric evaluation notes claiming I had exhibited violent tendencies during our marriage. It included fabricated pharmacy records suggesting a history of substance abuse. It included manufactured text messages proving I had been conducting an affair of my own. Everything was lies, but the lies were documented, signed, notarized by witnesses I had never met, and attached to the filing was a court order. I was required to undergo a mandatory psychiatric evaluation within 7 days. If I failed to appear, I would automatically forfeit all claims to marital property. If the evaluation found me mentally unstable, Preston would have grounds for everything he wanted. I sat in Margaret's office staring at the papers as the full scope of his conspiracy became clear. He planned this for months. I whispered, maybe years. The gala humiliation was just one piece. He has been building a case against me systematically. Margaret nodded slowly. Your friends, your social connections, your former colleagues. He has contacted them all. His attorneys have been gathering statements, building a narrative of your alleged instability. You have been isolated by design. The realization was devastating. I had thought I was invisible. I had thought Preston simply did not care about me, that I had become irrelevant to his life. The truth was worse. He had been watching me the entire time, studying me, planning my destruction piece by piece while I smiled at dinner parties and pretended everything was fine. But he did not know about the deed. He did not know about Dorothy's recordings. He did not know that the wife he had dismissed as weak and passive was about to become his worst nightmare. Bradley Ashford met me at a coffee shop in Stamford, 2 towns over from Greenwich, where the Ashford name carried less weight. He arrived wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down, looking nothing like the polished heir he had once been groomed to become. There were shadows under his eyes and a weariness in his posture that spoke to years of fighting battles no one believed he was fighting. He ordered black coffee and slid into the booth across from me. The vinyl seat squeaked beneath his weight. Thank you for meeting me, I said. He shrugged. I have been waiting 5 years for someone in this family to finally see the truth about Preston. When I heard about what happened at the gala, I knew it was time. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, staring into the dark liquid. Preston told everyone I was a drug addict. He continued. He manufactured evidence, fake rehabilitation center records, paid witnesses who claimed they saw me using. He convinced my own mother I was stealing from her retirement accounts to fund a habit I never had. His jaw tightened. I lost everything. My position at the company, my inheritance, my reputation, my relationship with every family member who believed his lies. He looked up at me. Sound familiar? I nodded slowly. He is doing the same thing to me. Fabricated psychiatric records, forged pharmacy documents, false witnesses. Bradley's expression hardened. That is his playbook. Find the victim's weakness and manufacture evidence around it. Make everyone believe the lie before the truth has a chance to surface. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward me. But Preston made a mistake with me. He forgot that some people at the company still remember what really happened. They know I was framed, and they have been quietly gathering information ever since. I opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, company financial reports with highlighted entries. The numbers were staggering. Preston has been embezzling from Ashford Properties for 18 months, Bradley explained. Somewhere around $4.2 million so far. He is laundering the money through Vanessa's public relations firm. There is a paper trail, transaction records, shell company registrations. I flipped through the documents. Each page represented another crime, another betrayal, another layer of deception I had never suspected. How did you get these? I asked. Bradley smiled grimly. I still have friends in the accounting department. People who remember what Preston did to me and want to see him held accountable. They have been copying files for months, waiting for the right moment to expose him. I thought about the psychiatric evaluation scheduled for next week. I thought about Preston's manufactured evidence. I thought about the viral video and the 50,000 strangers who had watched my humiliation and judged me without knowing any of the truth. We need to be strategic. I said, we cannot play all our cards at once. Bradley nodded. What are you thinking? I explained the plan Margaret and I had been developing. We would let Preston believe he was winning. I would attend the psychiatric evaluation willingly, presenting myself as calm and cooperative. Meanwhile, Bradley would continue gathering financial evidence. We would build our case carefully, documenting everything, and then at the Ashford annual board meeting in 3 weeks, we would strike. Bradley studied me for a long moment. His expression shifted from skeptical to something approaching respect. You know, he said finally, I always thought you were too quiet, too passive. I thought Preston had broken you completely the way he breaks everyone who gets close to him. He finished his coffee in one long swallow. I was wrong. You were just waiting for the right moment. For the first time in weeks. I almost smiled. That makes 2 of us. The psychiatric evaluation took place in a beige office building on the outskirts of Greenwich. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Motivational posters with phrases like, choose happiness, and one step at a time lined the walls and frames that had not been dusted in months. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting for my name to be called. The psychiatrist assigned to my case was Dr. Catherine Pierce. I had researched her credentials before arriving. Board certified, 20 years of experience, generally well reviewed by former patients. She seemed fair, professional, the kind of evaluator who would base her conclusions on facts rather than assumptions. I was wrong about that too. Mrs. Ashford. A receptionist appeared in the doorway. Dr. Pierce will see you now. I've followed her down a long hallway to an office decorated in the same institutional beige as the waiting room. Dr. Pierce sat behind a wooden desk, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She smiled warmly and gestured to a chair across from her. Please make yourself comfortable. This is just a conversation. There are no right or wrong answers. For 90 minutes, she asked me questions about my childhood, my education, my career before marriage, my relationship with Preston, my emotional state over the past 6 years. I answered everything calmly and honestly. I explained the isolation I had experienced, the gradual erosion of my self-confidence, the affair I had discovered and been told to ignore, the public humiliation at the gala, and my husband's response. Dr. Pierce listened carefully, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. Her expression remained neutral throughout, giving nothing away. Finally, she set down her pen. Mrs. Ashford, she said gently, based on our conversation today, I see no evidence of the conditions described in your husband's filing. You appear articulate, self-aware, and emotionally regulated. Your responses indicate someone processing a difficult situation, not someone experiencing mental instability. Relief flooded through me like warm water. Thank you. I will be recommending that the court dismiss the psychiatric hold requirement. There is simply no clinical basis for it. I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in an hour. The evaluation was over. I had passed. Preston's manufactured narrative was beginning to crumble. Then Dr. Pierce's expression changed. However, she continued slowly. Your husband has requested permission to provide additional testimony. He is waiting outside with a witness who claims to have relevant information. Before I could object, the office door opened. Preston entered wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of deep concern. Behind him came a woman I had never seen before. She was middle-aged with graying brown hair and nervous eyes that darted around the room without settling anywhere. "This is Anna Campbell," Preston announced, gesturing to the stranger. "She worked with Caroline at her architecture firm before our marriage. She can provide important context about my wife's behavior." I stared at the woman. I had never met her. I did not recognize her face or her name. In 5 years of running my own firm, I had never employed anyone named Anna Campbell, but she seemed to recognize me. Or at least she had been paid to pretend she did. "I worked with Caroline for 3 years, Anna said. Her voice trembled convincingly. She was brilliant at her job, but she had serious problems. Mood swings, angry outbursts, alcohol dependency. She paused, as if gathering courage to continue. Once, she threw a computer monitor across the office during a client meeting. She screamed at an intern until the poor girl was in tears. We were all afraid of her. I opened my mouth to protest, but Preston was already producing documents. "I also have pharmacy records," he said smoothly, fanning papers across Dr. Pierce's desk. Prescriptions Carolyn filled under a maiden name at pharmacies across the state. Anti-anxiety medication, sleeping pills, pain medication in quantities suggesting abuse. His voice dripped with false sympathy, and text messages showing her communications with a man she was seeing behind my back. I did not want to believe it, but the evidence is undeniable. The documents were fabricated. Every word was lies, but they looked official. They carried proper letterheads and signature blocks. The woman seemed sincere, her anxiety appearing genuine rather than performed. Dr. Pierce's expression shifted from sympathetic to uncertain. She studied the new evidence with furrowed brows. "Mrs. Ashford," she said slowly, "these are serious allegations. This new information contradicts much of what you told me earlier." "They are lies," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "All of it. I have never met that woman. Those documents are forged. My husband has been manufacturing evidence against me for months." Preston shook his head sadly, turning to Dr. Pierce with the practiced expression of a long-suffering spouse. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Denial. Deflection. She cannot accept responsibility for her own actions. She sees conspiracies everywhere." Dr. Pierce made notes in her file. "I will need time to review this additional information carefully." "Of course," Preston said. He placed a hand over his heart. "All I want is for my wife to get the help she needs, whatever that looks like." The evaluation ended without a clear verdict. Dr. Pierce scheduled a follow-up appointment and said she would be conducting additional interviews before making her final recommendation. I walked outside into gray autumn light and stood on the empty sidewalk. My hands were shaking. My chest felt hollow. I had entered that building believing I could win with truth and composure, but the system was rigged. No matter what I said, Preston had a counter prepared. He had been planning this for months while I smiled at dinner parties and pretended everything was fine. My phone buzzed. A text from Bradley. "I found everything. The complete financial records. Every transaction documented. Meet me at Margaret's office tonight." I stood there for a long moment, feeling the despair transform into something else. Something harder. Something more dangerous. Preston wanted me broken. Instead, he had given me the clarity to destroy him completely. Margaret spread the documents across her conference table like a general mapping a battlefield. Bank statements covered the polished wood, wire transfers, shell company registrations, 18 months of financial records that told a story of systematic theft. "This is enough to send your husband to federal prison," she announced. "The paper trail is remarkably clear. Money flows from Ashford Properties through a series of shell companies, then through Vanessa Blake's public relations firm, and finally into offshore accounts controlled by Preston personally." She tapped a highlighted entry on one of the statements. $4.2 million, embezzled from his own family's company while his father was still the chairman of the board. Bradley leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "The annual board meeting is in 2 weeks. Richard Caldwell is the new chairman since Theodore stepped back for health reasons. He has already expressed concerns about discrepancies in the quarterly reports." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "We now have 3 weapons in our arsenal. The property deed proving Caroline legally owns the mansion, the embezzlement evidence proving Preston committed fraud against the company, and the affair documentation proving his relationship with Vanessa. She looked at me across the table. We deploy them in sequence for maximum impact. First, we approach the board privately and share the financial evidence. Second, we file criminal charges through the district attorney's office. Third, we reveal the property deed at the moment it will cause the most damage to Preston's position. I studied the evidence spread before me. Every document represented another lie Preston had told, another person he had deceived, another life he had damaged in pursuit of his own desires. What about the psychiatric evaluation, I asked. Dr. Pierce seemed uncertain after Preston's performance with his fake witness. Margaret waved dismissively. Once we present this evidence, no court in Connecticut will give weight to fabricated testimony. The false witness will be exposed. The forged documents will be challenged by forensic experts. Your husband's entire narrative will collapse. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that the legal system would protect me. That truth would eventually prevail over manufactured lies. Then my phone rang. Dorothy's name appeared on the screen. Her voice was shaking when I answered. Mrs. Caroline, something has happened. It is Mr. Theodore. My blood went cold. What about him? He collapsed at dinner this evening. His heart, they are taking him to Greenwich Hospital right now. The doctors say it is very serious. I was at the hospital within 20 minutes. The building was old and sprawling, its halls smelling of disinfectant and fear. I found Theodore in the cardiac intensive care unit, lying in a bed surrounded by beeping machines and worried nurses. His face was pale against the white pillows. His breathing came through an oxygen mask in shallow, uneven gasps, but his eyes were open, and when he saw me enter the room, he managed a weak smile. Caroline. I rushed to his bedside and took his hand. It felt fragile, the skin paper-thin over prominent bones. Do not try to speak. Save your strength. He shook his head slightly, the movement costing him visible effort. Listen to me, he whispered through the mask. I know what my son has become. I saw it years ago. That is why I gave you the deed. That is why I trusted you with everything. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. Prove me right. Carolyn, show everyone who the real Ashford is. I sat by his bed until the nurses insisted I leave. In the hallway outside the ICU, I encountered the last person I wanted to see. Preston stood near the elevator wearing a dark suit and an expression of practiced grief. A television news crew was setting up nearby, microphones and cameras at the ready. He was about to give a statement. My father's condition is very serious. He announced to the assembled reporters, the stress of recent events has taken a terrible toll on our entire family. He paused meaningfully, his eyes finding mine across the corridor. Some people cannot accept when a marriage is over. Some people create drama that affects everyone around them. My father is paying the price for that selfishness. He did not name me directly. He did not have to. The cameras captured everything. My shocked expression, my stained cheeks, my obvious distress at Theodore's condition, which Preston was somehow twisting into evidence of my instability. By tomorrow, this footage would be on every news channel in Connecticut. The narrative would be clear. The crazy wife was destroying the Ashford family, and now the patriarch was paying the ultimate price. I walked out of the hospital into cold night air and stood in the parking lot, staring at the stars. The board meeting was in 12 days. Theodore might not survive to see me claim what he had given me, and Preston was using his father's suffering to destroy me. The Ashford Properties annual board meeting coincided with the company's winter gala, held as always at Ashford Manor. The mansion blazed with light against the December darkness. 200 of Connecticut's most influential people filled the ballroom. Media representatives lined the entrance, their cameras capturing every arrival. I entered through the service door, just as I had planned with Dorothy weeks before. She met me in the kitchen, her face creased with worry and determination. Are you ready? I nodded. I have been ready for 6 years. I just did not know it. She handed me a garment bag. Inside was a black gown. Simple, elegant, powerful. The opposite of the ivory dress that had been destroyed at the last gala. Tonight, Boan, I was not a victim waiting to be humiliated. I was a woman reclaiming what had been stolen. I dressed quickly in the service hallway and checked my reflection in a small mirror mounted by the door. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Not the invisible wife who had floated through these halls like a ghost. Not the humiliated target who had stood frozen while wine soaked through her mother's dress. Someone stronger, someone dangerous, someone ready. I stepped into the ballroom. The reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Heads swiveled in my direction, and the whispers began spreading like fire through dry grass. I thought she was in a psychiatric facility. Someone muttered nearby, "Isn't there a restraining order? She has nerve showing up here, of all places." I ignored them all. I walked through the crowd with my head high, my gaze fixed on the front of the room where Preston stood with Vanessa on his arm. They were laughing together, secure in their victory, confident that I had been destroyed utterly, reduced to a cautionary tale about unstable wives and failed marriages. Preston saw me first. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. "Carolyn." His voice cracked on my name. "What are you doing here? You are not supposed to be anywhere near this property." I smiled calmly. "Actually, I own this property. Check the deed." The room fell absolutely silent. 200 people stared. Cameras from the media area swung toward the confrontation. Phones rose to capture whatever was about to happen. Vanessa laughed nervously. "She has completely lost her mind." Preston recovered his composure, but I could see panic behind his eyes. "This is ridiculous. Security needs to remove this woman immediately." But no security came, because Dorothy had spoken to the guards ahead of time, because the guards worked for the household, and the household answered to the property owner, and the property owner was me. I stepped past Preston and Vanessa, walking to the front of the ballroom where a podium stood ready for the evening's speeches. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "1 month ago, I stood in this exact space and was publicly humiliated. My husband watched while his mistress poured wine on my dress. 200 of you witnessed it. Many of you recorded it." I paused, letting the memory settle over the crowd. "Tonight, I am here to correct the record." I nodded toward Bradley, who stood at the audio-visual control station near the back of the room. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. First came the footage from Dorothy's security recordings. Vanessa watching me across the ballroom, moving into position, selecting the wine glass, timing her approach perfectly, tilting her wrist with deliberate precision. The video made clear what had been obvious to anyone watching, honestly. The wine pour was not an accident. It was a calculated attack. Gasps rippled through the audience. Then came the financial documents. Bank statements scrolling across the screen. Wire transfers. Shell company registrations. The $4.2 million trail of embezzlement leading directly to Preston Ashford and Vanessa Blake. Richard Caldwell, the board chairman, pushed through the crowd toward the front of the room. His face was pale with barely controlled fury. "Is this accurate?" he demanded, staring at the numbers on the screen. Margaret Holloway appeared beside me, handing him a folder of certified documents. "Every transaction has been verified by forensic accountants," she announced. "Ashford Properties has been systematically defrauded by its own chief operations officer for 18 months. Preston backed away from the screen, shaking his head. "No, this is impossible. These documents are fabricated. She manufactured all of this." But his voice had lost its confident edge. The mask was slipping, and everyone in the room could see the truth behind it. Vanessa tried to slip toward the exit, but Dorothy blocked her path with 2 security guards. "Going somewhere." "Miss Blake," the guards closed in. Vanessa's expression shifted from arrogant to terrified. Richard Caldwell turned to the security team. "Escort Mr. Ashford and Miss Blake to the library. They will be detained there until the authorities arrive." Preston lunged toward me. "You cannot do this. This is my family's company. This is my family's house." I held up the certified copy of the property deed. "Actually," I said calmly, "the house is mine. Your father transferred ownership to me on our wedding day. He saw exactly what you were becoming. He wanted to make sure I would be protected from you." I watched my husband's face crumble as the truth finally registered. "You spent 6 years making me feel like a guest in my own home. You isolated me. You humiliated me. You tried to have me declared mentally unstable using fabricated evidence and paid witnesses." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "Tonight, You learn what it feels like to be the one who does not belong. The aftermath was swift, thorough, and utterly devastating to everything Preston had built. Richard Caldwell convened an emergency board session in the mansion's library while shocked guests milled in the ballroom, whispering among themselves and checking their phones for news updates. Within 2 hours, Preston was stripped of all positions at Ashford Properties. His access to company accounts was revoked, his corporate credit cards were canceled, his security clearance was terminated. Detective Morrison from the Greenwich Police Department arrived to arrest Vanessa on preliminary charges of fraud and money laundering. The officers were professional but firm, handcuffing her in full view of the remaining guests. "You cannot do this," she screamed as they led her toward the waiting patrol car. "Preston, do something. Tell them this is all a mistake." But Preston was in no position to help anyone, including himself. He sat in the library corner with his head in his hands while attorneys and board members discussed his fate. The man who had controlled every aspect of our marriage, who had convinced me I was worthless and invisible and completely dependent on his generosity, now looked small and broken and utterly defeated. Margaret approached me with a tablet showing social media updates. "The story is everywhere," she reported. "Video from tonight is trending nationally. The narrative has completely reversed." I glanced at the screen. Comments were flooding in from strangers across the country. She owned the mansion the whole time. That revenge was absolutely ice cold. Queen behavior right there. I handed the tablet back. "It does not feel like revenge." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What does it feel like?" I considered the question carefully. The anger I had carried for months was gone. The fear that had paralyzed me was gone. The desperate need to prove my worth to people who would never see it was gone. "Closure, I said finally. "It feels like closure." Theodore's doctors called the next morning with good news. His condition had stabilized overnight. The stress of not knowing whether his plan would work had apparently been worse for his heart than the relief of knowing it had succeeded. When I visited him in the hospital, he was sitting up in bed eating oatmeal and watching news coverage of his son's arrest. I heard what happened. He said when I entered, his eyes were bright despite his pallor. I wish I could have been there to see his face. I took his hand gently. "You were there, you gave me the tools to fight back years ago. I just was not ready to use them." He squeezed my fingers with strength that surprised me. "What will you do now?" I had spent the entire previous night thinking about that question. For 6 years, I had defined myself by my marriage, by my husband's family, by a mansion I had believed belonged to someone else. Now everything was different. "I am going back to architecture," I said. "I am going to rebuild my firm. I am going to design buildings that actually help people." Theodore smiled. "Your mother would be proud." I blinked back unexpected tears. "I hope so." The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later in a brief hearing before Judge Patricia Winters. Margaret had negotiated terms that were, in her words, extraordinarily favorable to my interests. Preston signed everything without argument. He was facing federal embezzlement charges and a possible prison sentence. Fighting his wife over furniture and artwork was the least of his concerns. The final court appearance took less than 15 minutes. A clerk read the terms. Both parties confirmed their acceptance. The judge declared the marriage legally dissolved and wished us both well in our future endeavors. Outside the courthouse, the December air was cold and crisp. Bradley was waiting on the steps. "How does it feel?" he asked. I looked up at the gray winter sky. The clouds were breaking apart, letting thin shafts of sunlight through for the first time in weeks, like the first day of the rest of my life. Bradley nodded slowly. He understood exactly what I meant. "What happens to Preston now?" Federal prosecutors had taken over the embezzlement case. The evidence was overwhelming. His attorneys were negotiating a plea deal that would minimize his sentence in exchange for full cooperation. But even with good behavior, he was facing at least 18 months in a minimum security facility. Vanessa's situation was worse. She had been the primary conduit for laundering the stolen funds. She was facing 3 to 5 years for fraud and conspiracy. I thought I would feel satisfaction at their downfall, triumph at their punishment, vindication for everything they had done to me. Instead, I felt only relief that it was over, and eagerness to begin again. Spring sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office. Whitfield Architecture occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Greenwich. a building I had personally selected for its clean lines and abundant natural light. 6 employees worked at desks arranged in an open floor plan. Drawings and blueprints covered every available surface. We specialized in affordable housing design now. Community centers, shelters, the kind of projects that actually improve people's lives rather than just impressing wealthy clients. It was the work I had always wanted to do, before I lost myself in a marriage that never deserved me. My phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. Everything is ready for tonight. The flowers arrived. The caterers are setting up. It is going to be beautiful. I smiled and returned to the blueprints spread across my desk. A community center for a neighborhood in Bridgeport that had been waiting years for investment. 30,000 square feet of space for after-school programs, job training, and family services. Real work, meaningful work, work that mattered. The mansion was hosting a charity gala that evening, just as it had hosted galas for decades under Ashford ownership. But this event was entirely different. The Greenwich Foundation for Domestic Abuse Survivors, an organization I had founded 3 months ago using a portion of my divorce settlement. Tonight was our inaugural fundraiser, and every ticket had sold out within a week. I arrived at the mansion at 6 o'clock. The ballroom had been transformed. Soft golden lighting replaced the harsh chandelier glare I remembered from previous galas. Elegant flowers in soft pinks and creams decorated every table. A string quartet played music that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. 200 guests filled the room. But these were not the same society vultures who had watched my humiliation and done nothing to help. These were donors, advocates, survivors, people who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. Bradley found me near the entrance, wearing a proper suit for once. He had started working with my architecture firm 2 months ago, managing business development and client relationships. It turned out the black sheep of the Ashford family had considerable talents that had never been given a chance to flourish. Nice turnout, he observed. Bigger than expected. I nodded. We raised over $200,000 before dinner even started. He grinned. Theodore would be proud. I glanced toward the corner of the room where my father-in-law sat in a wheelchair, with a wool blanket across his lap. His doctors had advised against attending, but he had insisted. This was the first gala in the mansion's history that actually meant something. He had told them. He would not miss it for the world. He caught my eye from across the room and raised his champagne glass in a small salute. At 8 o'clock, I took the stage. The room fell quiet. 200 faces looked up at me with expressions of respect and anticipation. I remembered standing in this same space 6 months ago, wine dripping from my mother's pearls, my dress ruined, my husband checking on his mistress, while I stood frozen in humiliation. Tonight, I wore ivory again. Not the same dress, of course. My mother's gown had been destroyed beyond repair, but I had found a similar style, elegant and simple, and I had chosen to wear it deliberately, reclaiming what had been taken. Thank you all for being here. I began. My voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. 6 months ago, I stood in this room at my lowest point. I had lost my voice. I had lost my identity. I had spent years allowing someone else to define my worth. I paused, letting the words settle. I believed that silence would keep the peace. I believed that being small and invisible would protect me. I believed that if I just endured long enough, things would eventually get better on their own. I shook my head slowly. I was wrong. Silence does not keep the peace. Silence protects the wrong people, and things do not get better until you make them better. The audience listened with complete attention. I saw women nodding. I saw men with tears in their eyes. I saw survivors recognizing their own stories and mine. I built this foundation because I know what it feels like to be erased, to have your reality questioned, to believe you deserve the pain you are experiencing, to lose yourself so completely that you forget who you were before. I straightened my shoulders, but I also know what it feels like to come back, to reclaim your power, to speak your truth even when your voice shakes, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of what was destroyed. I looked out at the crowd. Dorothy stood near the back, wiping tears from her cheeks. Walls do not make a legacy. Character does. And ours was always stronger than we knew. The applause began slowly, then built to something overwhelming. People rose to their feet. The sound filled the ballroom like a wave, washing away the last traces of humiliation and fear that had once defined this space for me. I stepped down from the stage and let the sound wash over me. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the caterers had packed up their equipment, I stood alone on the mansion's rear balcony. The gardens were beginning to bloom in the spring warmth. Tulips and daffodils pushed through the dark soil, their colors vivid against the green lawn. Dorothy appeared beside me with 2 cups of tea. Long way from that night in the kitchen, she observed. I accepted the cup and wrapped my fingers around its warmth. The steam rose in delicate curls against the cool night air. Thank you, I said quietly, for everything you did, the recordings, the information, the courage to trust me with the truth. Dorothy shrugged. I just kept records. You did the hard part. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear above the Connecticut tree line. Whatever happened to her? Dorothy asked after a while. To Vanessa, I took a sip of tea. 3 years for fraud. She is in a federal facility in Virginia. Last I heard, she was teaching a fitness class to other inmates. Dorothy snorted. Fitting. And him, Preston, had received 18 months for embezzlement. He was due to be released in another 8 months, assuming continued good behavior. But he would emerge into a very different world than the one he had left. No company, no mansion, no social standing, no family willing to acknowledge his existence. The charming heir who had once controlled everything would have to start over from nothing, just like I had. He does not matter anymore, I said finally, and for the first time, I truly meant it. The moon rose over Ashford Manor. My manor now. The home I had reclaimed through courage and persistence and the help of people who believed in me when I could not believe in myself. I finished my tea and handed the empty cup to Dorothy. Thank you for staying, I said. After everything that happened, you could have left. Dorothy smiled, the expression softening the weathered lines of her face. This house needed someone worth serving. Now it finally has one. She headed back inside, leaving me alone with the spring night and the stars. I thought about my mother, about the dress that had connected me to her memory, about the pearls I still wore around my neck, cleaned and restored. Survivors like me. I thought about Theodore, recovering slowly but steadily, proud of the legacy his gift had protected. I thought about Bradley, finding his purpose after years of being dismissed as worthless. I thought about Margaret, adding another victory to her undefeated record. I thought about all the women who would walk through the doors of the foundation I had created, all the survivors who would find resources and support and hope, all the invisible wives who would learn, as I had learned, that their voices mattered. The future stretched out before me like an unwritten blueprint. Infinite possibilities, unlimited potential. A life finally, completely my own. I took one last look at the gardens, at the stars, at the mansion that had witnessed my worst moments and now hosted my greatest triumph. Then I went inside to start planning tomorrow. There was work to do, houses to design, survivors to help, a future to build, and for the first time in years, I was ready.